Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first BrainMap of 2025. We are very glad to see you all here, people in the room and on the Zoom. So, yeah, I'm just going to say my line that you know probably by now. Everyone knows it by heart. And then I'm just going to pass it over to Bastian to actually introduce our host today. So we are very grateful for the P41 funded Center for Mesoscale Imaging at Martinos that supports BrainMap Seminar Series, and all of you, of course. So with that, I'll hand it over to Bastian to basically introduce our speaker today. Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming, and thanks, Ilias, for making the trip from New York. So today we have Ilias Giannakopoulos, who is a long friend of Larry's group, myself, Jason included. Ilias did his PhD at Caltech with Thanos Polymeritis, I think primarily. And then also did a stint at MIT working with Jacob White and Rick. And he's really an expert in computational electromagnetics and computational methods in general. He's going to talk about that today. And also during his postdoc at NYU with Daniel Selexon and Ricardo Latenzi, he developed some AI method for reconstruction. So looking forward.
Thank you. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to talk at BrainMap today. And thanks a lot, Jason and Bastian and Larry for organizing this and Abbas. So yeah, as Bastian said, I will talk a little bit about all of the research that I have done during my PhD at Caltech at MIT and in my postdoctoral career so far at NYU. So just a little bit of information about me. I'm from Greece, from Athens, but I did my undergrad and master's in Thessaloniki in electrical and computer engineering. Then I moved to Russia, to Moscow, where I pursued a PhD in computational data science and engineering. And while I was there, I had the chance to visit MIT as a PhD student and work in the research laboratory of electronics with Jacob White on computational prototyping. And currently, I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Radiology in NYU, working under the supervision of Professor Ricardo Latenzi. So my research and basically the talk outline has focused on electromagnetic simulations, in particular on methods that model the interactions between RF coils and biological tissue. Other methods that utilize these simulations to estimate the ideal current patterns that lead to optimal SNR and the ultimate SNR approximation methods, and also inverse problems that rely on these electromagnetic simulations as the forward problem solutions, in particular coil optimization and electrical property reconstruction. Also, something that's not really an inverse problem is the way to use these simulations as faster data generators for supervised learning with an application of electrical property reconstruction. And finally, in a completely different topic, I will also talk a little bit about accelerated image reconstruction, since we'll be already talking about supervised learning. So let's start with the electromagnetic simulations and the motivation, which one obvious motivation for new simulation tools is the ultra-high field MRI, where we know that the higher field leads to higher SNR and finer spatiotemporal resolution that have the ability to show us finer structure and physiological effects, and potentially better determine the aggressiveness of tumors in the body, for example, in the prostate or the breast. The limitation of higher fields is the shorter wavelength that can lead to constructive and destructive interference patterns that can have a detrimental effect on the quality of the images and the safety of the patients. So we need new simulation tools to design coils for these higher field strengths. And of course, there are many commercial packages out there that are exceptional, and their main limitation is that they might require a few days to converge or have high memory demands. And that's because they are based on the differential form of Maxwell's equations, which allow them to work for a general spectrum of electromagnetic simulations for very low frequencies to very high ones. But when it comes to the specific problem like MRI, they have this time and memory, this large time and memory footprints. So On the other hand, we have integral equation methods that they're prohibitively slow for general purpose simulations. But when it comes to a single frequency, like MRI, they provide an ideal platform for customization of their algorithms because they utilize dense matrices. And these dense matrices have specific properties. And today we'll mostly look at the low rank and hidden low rank properties that they might have. And in this area, that's why Marie was created, that there is a suite that utilizes these integral equations to solve the electromagnetic problem for MRI frequencies. So if I were to summarize Marie with just one slide, I would just use this one. So basically, Marie solves this coupled system of integral equations. And what we need to do is to model the geometric and electromagnetic interactions between the particular coil setup that we might have, which includes maybe a Berthiez coil that I have here and the sealed, discretized with triangular elements, and the body model. Here it's a head and it's discretized with a uniform voxelized grid. So Marie solves this system of integral equations and computes the electric currents in the coil and the body based on some voltage excitation maybe on the coil. Now Marie, unfortunately, is now free of limitations. And the first one is some memory constraints that are there. The first one is that the interactions between the body elements, the voxels, although their full form requires exabytes, they can be reduced to gigabytes if we exploit the toplet structure of the N operator that is inside the ZBB matrix. But still, these gigabytes can be a few hundreds of them. That gives the first memory constraint. The other memory constraint is the coupling matrix that models the interactions between the coil and the body. And this can start from a few gigabytes and can end up to hundreds of terabytes or even more if we do find resolutions for the body. The second limitation is the accuracy. And this is because Marie relies on a piecewise constant approximation for the fields, which means that we have 3 unknowns per voxel, the current in X, Y, and Z, basically. And we can see on the right here that at 5 millimeter resolution, Marie tends to overestimate the field. We have this example here for a dielectric pad next to a brain. While the finite difference time domain simulation it gives consistent results for all 3 resolutions that we have. The second issue is kind of similar. It relates to the coils, that we use flat triangles to approximate the coils. This might be a little bit problematic when it comes to curved coils or coils modeled within wires that you might benefit from other types of discretizations. So at first, in terms of the coils, we use curvilinear triangles instead of flat ones. And for this example here, for a head that loads a loop coil, we see that the relative error of the electric field drops now quadratically as we increase the numbers of unknowns, comparing to the linear drop that it has when we use the flat triangles. The flat triangles correspond to these RWG basis functions, while the curvilinear ones use these CWB basis functions, which are the initials of the authors that came up with these different discretization schemes. For the body, that is the more qualitatively evident. If we use piecewise linear basis functions, which means 12 unknowns per voxel now, we see that at 5 millimeter, we are as good as FTDT and even better. So we see consistent results here that it fixes kind of this overestimation error that we had before. Now moving to the memory problem, for this body model, 2 millimeter resolution, and using piecewise linear basis functions, we have 400 million unknowns. So even just the computational domain for this problem is half a gigabyte. Now the N operator in its full form, it's 2 exabytes, and with the technique that we do in Marie that involves toplets and circulant matrices, the memory drops to 250 gigabytes. Not prohibitive for a server with a lot of CPU, but prohibitive even with the newest GPUs out there. So if we really want to exploit the acceleration in GPUs, we need to find other approaches. And my main contribution in this compression was the utilization of the Tucker decomposition to compress these operators drastically down to 70 megabytes. So just for the next two slides, I have a little bit of math, but there's no, we don't need to be very strict about it. So the Tucker decomposition is a we can think of it as a very vague generalization of the SVD in 3 dimensions. Basically, you start from your tensor, and then you decompose it to three, in this 3-dimensional case, to three factors, 3 Tucker factors, and one small tensor that we call the Tucker core. And the way to do this is to use the higher order singular value decomposition. So you need to unfold your tensor in 3 different ways. So look at the matrices through the slice or the columns or the rows, and then apply SVD on these matrices. And the left singular matrices are now the Tucker factors. And the core can be computed with these tensor matrix products. Now, this approximation is good for the 3-dimensional case because it's stable. And it's also better than all the other alternatives that we have for 3-dimensional problems. And that is also evident from these results that I have the compression factor here. So depending on the tolerance that you use for the higher order SVD, you can achieve a compression factor that starts from 2,000, actually 1,500 to up to 10,000 for your N operator. And it's also better than the tensor train approach and the cross-Tucker approximation, which are 2 different methods that can do this compression. Now, in terms of simulation time, what does that mean? Nothing really. So if you rerun the problem in the same processing unit, you won't get any speed up. But you are now able to use GPU because you have this much slower memory. So while the full problem for this head model cannot fit in GPU, it has to run in CPU for almost 3 hours, where with the new approach, we can run in GPU for 15 minutes. And another good thing with this approach is that the error is basically negligible because you have freedom in the choice of the tolerance of the higher order SVD. And Marie is solved with an iterative solver. So as long as the threshold of the iterative solver is less than the tolerance of the SVD, you are fine, and you don't lose any digits of precision. Now back to the coupling matrix with the issue that requires up to hundreds of terabytes. So just to give you some preliminary information, the coupling matrix models the interactions between triangles and voxels. Now you can see three vectors here. This means that we have 3 unknowns per voxels because we're doing piecewise constant for this example. So what you can do here is that you can take each of these vectors and reshape them to tensors. And these tensors now model interactions between remote elements, so they are low Tucker rank. So you can compress each of these individual tensors using the Tucker decomposition again, and get a really vast compression. So for example, for this body coil at 3 Tesla, we can see that even from 5mm resolution, your memory, the full memory of the coupling matrix is more than 150 gigabytes. And if you use piecewise linear, much more. And when you go to 2mm and 1mm, the memory drastically increases. Of course, there are methods based on matrix decompositions that can give you some compression, but for finer resolutions, this compression is not giving us what we need. And still, at 1mm, the simulation is practically impossible, even if you have a large server. But with the Tucker decomposition approach, you can essentially kill all this memory and then lead the problem down to just a few gigabytes that can fit even in the old GPUs that can go up to 8 gigabytes of memory. Other approaches that we explored, there's no need to go through the math there. There are methods that are based on the pre-corrected FFT, 4-dimensional cross-tensor train approach. But you can think of it as the current state of the art for Marie. And the simulation time that we achieve here allows us to use the GPU for 5mm, 2mm, and 1mm resolution while the other approach is, as soon as we go to 2 millimeter, they can only be used in CPUs, and they're out of memory, even in CPU with piecewise linear basis functions. So, and I should note here that we use a 40 gigabyte GPU, so even at 40 gigabyte, the classic methods kind of fail. So what else needs to be done, and where my K99 now comes into play? So for this next year, the plan is to include also wires in Marie. And the main reason for that is that if you try to solve this coil with a surface discretization, you will end up with a dense matrix, which is 1 million by 1 million, and is not compressible with traditional matrix decomposition approaches. While if you use wires, you can use line segments to approximate the coil, and this approximation can lead to matrices that just require a few gigabytes of memory. So you can technically include this entire scenario in your simulation, and of course, you have to take into account the TXRX switch for the proper excitation. And to do that, we're planning to include an automatic co-simulation that will do tuning, matching, and decoupling in case of the receivers, also preamplifier decoupling. And this co-simulation will be done with global optimizations, such as particle swarm, using the circuit equations that are involved when you try to tune and decouple and match this type of coils. So towards the next part of my talk, we saw so far the forward problem. What if you have a coil and if you have a body model that you can find the fields? But what about optimization methods, and what if you need ultimate metrics? So if you want to achieve the best performance for a coil, what should be your the benchmark value that you're looking for? So for that, there is a theory of the ultimate SNR, which is the highest possible SNR that a specific anatomy can have. And this specific anatomy is so patient-specific. And we also have the ideal current patterns that these currents are able to achieve the highest possible SNR for a specific voxel in your anatomy, and are patient-specific and also surface support-specific, which means that a different coil substrate has different optimal current distribution that gives you the corresponding optimal SNR. So I will try to explain the approach with a pseudo algorithm to avoid going into the math. So if you have a closed surface that surrounds your body model, the Hoy has Fresnel principle holds. So all possible electromagnetic field distributions within the body can be generated from sources on the surface. So we saw before the coupling matrix that can model the interactions between these type of surfaces and the body. So you can construct the basis of incident fields just by taking the SVD of that coupling matrix between the ultimate basis and the body. And then if you have all these orthogonal incident fields, you can solve the volume integral equation, the bottom right part of Marie, and now you get a basis of total electric and magnetic fields, and you can use these fields to compute the SNR. Now, as you decrease the SVD tolerance and you repeat these simulations, you will see that the SNR converges to a bounding value, and that's the ultimate intrinsic SNR. And the incident fields that give you this ultimate SNR can be back projected to the surface, and this gives you the ideal current patterns. So we tried 4 different examples here. The first one is the ultimate basis to see what's the ultimate performance that we can get for this head model. And we also tried 4 different coil substrates. The simplified one is the bell, that it shouldn't cover the front part, but for simplicity, we allowed it to cover. And then we tried the helmet and the cylinder for birdcage type of coils. And we saw the optimal SNR and the ultimate SNR for these 4 cases. And you can see the distribution that the ultimate covers the head everywhere, of course, because it's also covering from the bottom, which is not practical in reality. And yeah, you can kind of see the distribution of the SNR, how it reflects the substrate that we use. Now, how are we sure these values are correct? We did the convergence study. We saw the mode, the rate of convergence. We took the derivative of the SNR in respect to the modes, and that reaches 0 the more modes that we add to all this type of bases. And we did this for 4 representative voxels, one in the bottom of the of the head, one on the top, one in the middle, and one in the back of the head. Now, here comes the more interesting part for me, that for the middle voxel, most of the substrates have the same SNR, and the same for the intermediate voxel in the back of the head. While for the bottom voxel, that we don't really have coverage, and in the top voxel, especially for the cylinder, we have a much lower SNR, which we kind of know, but it's nice to see an algorithmic a result that verifies that if you don't have the coverage there, you won't be able to achieve the optimal SNR in that location. Now onto the ideal current patterns. Using this SNR, we back project to the incident fields to the surface, and we see that the distribution, although it seems similar, is different, especially for the cylinder, that we have additional loops appearing in the bottom. All these configurations, these are for the voxel in the back of the head, resemble the butterfly coil, and yeah, they also have to project it to have to account for the different geometry of the substrate. Here's the time evolution for the helmet coil, and we see that the distribution of the ideal current patterns changes from the butterfly configuration, the two coils, to the single loop in the area in between them. So that's another important thing here, is that you cannot really directly use these ideal current patterns to design a coil, because these evolve in time, right? And you have to account many time points to, if you want to design a coil based on them. So we try to do that based on the 2 time points, and we took the three loops based on this configuration, and we saw that the SNR that these loops can achieve, if it's just one loop, it's 44%, but if we have the array of 3 loops, we can get 85%, at least at 3 Tesla of the optimal SNR, and of the ultimate SNR, I'm sorry, and then at 7 Tesla, these values slightly drop. So ideal current patterns can be used as a good initial guess for coil design, but then you need additional steps if you want to get the ultimate performance. So, yes.
So the fact that the ultimate current pattern changes with time, does this mean that fundamentally we'll never be able to get close to the ultimate? Like, I always thought of the ultimate as, well, if you are close enough and you have enough elements, you have loops and dipoles.
So
theoretically, it should really, really construct, but if the true ultimate changes with time, then
so yeah, I think that if you want to get a truly ultimate, like to 100% might be impossible, because you will need maybe impractical, not impossible, because the currents evolve in a different type of pattern. But for sure, if you have tons of loops or tons of coils there, you pretty much can have this a very good coverage of the brain. So you will be close to it. Now, if you go to very higher, yes, and they also don't resemble exactly the loops, right? And you have these additional patterns here that not on top of the loop, that if you also include that, you might be able to get better numbers. I think for lower frequencies, you're pretty much okay. But if you want to go to 10.5, maybe, or 14, for example, it will be really difficult to find it. Not impossible, but I would say it's really difficult. And one way to do it, to try to solve the problem, is after the ideal current patterns, after you come up with an initial guess, you can do coil optimization. And of course, if you add more coils, you can get closer to the optimal SNR. But it's not that the positions that we have here are truly correct, right? Because the ideal current patterns move. So what you can do is that what we did actually to approach this coil optimization problem now, is that we designed this graphical user interface that allows us to discretize coils on the fly on a 2D plane, because it allows for simplicity. and then we can map them directly on the three-dimensional coil substrate. So this allows us to parameterize the loop coils easily over the radius or their center. And for now, it's just this, but in general, you can make it a little bit more general and parameterize over the entire structure of the loop, or allow it to become an ellipsoid. And you can try to maximize the ratio of the SNR over the ultimate SNR. So if you do that with a simple gradient descent, for this particular example, you can see that we start from a configuration a little bit farther from the ideal current patterns. Slowly, you end up to the configuration of the ideal current patterns with a butterfly coil, and then your optimizer changes and comes up with something a little bit different. At some point, it stops. So with 3 loops, yes, you cannot go above that, unless, of course, there's a local minima there. But if you add more loops, maybe, yes, you can approach it at some specific location. Yes.
A really basic question. This is a nice example of one voxel.
Yes.
But how do you generalize this to covering the whole cerebral cortex, for example, if you get a very different solution for each voxel?
Yes. So the optimizer doesn't really change. So you can, instead of just doing one voxel, you can have a region of interest that you want to optimize for. This is still like ongoing, right? So I don't have these results yet. But as soon as you put additional loops there, it should find a configuration that is good enough to cover it. I'm not sure if it can achieve fully the ultimate SNR there, but the thing is, like, also what Larry is saying, that you need the additional loops and allow them to and redistribute them better, so you can get this extra percentage that we might miss sometimes with the coils that we design. No, it's not. It's not convex. No, it's not convex, and it also has a few additional difficulties. So that as you move the loops, you need to retune them, and there is no guarantee that the tuning that you have in the first place, like the S parameter, will be the same in another one. So you might have this small kind of nice noise perturbations that appear in the gradient of the gradient descent, and this creates the first problem. So you need to do 2 optimization, one inside the other. Outside you optimize the position, inside you tune the coil, and this makes it highly non-convex. But to avoid that, you can run a grid search in the beginning, and this grid search kind of finds a really good approximation. And the good thing is that you can stop after the grid search. You don't really need the gradient descent, because the gradient descent will just give you like 2, 3, or 4% more, but this will be tailored to the numerical model. So maybe when you build the coil, it won't be as optimal. So maybe it's good to stop a little bit early with the grid search.
Could you just make sure, if people are asking questions, either please be loud, or could you just repeat it for the people on Zoom also
Okay.
a little bit?
Great, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, the question is if the coil diameter is also subject to the optimization. Yes. So in this particular example, we moved the center of the loops and we changed the radius. Yes. Of course, you need to make sure that you include the coil noise in this type of simulations, because if you optimize for one particular voxel, you might end up with a tiny, tiny coil that looks like a ring, but has a really good SNR at one voxel. But of course, if you try to design that, it will not be practical. Okay, so the future plans, and this is the R00 part of my K99, is to basically combine all these different methods that I showed earlier to create a new 7 Tesla prostate coil. And the idea would be to aim to achieve a 0.3 in plane spatial resolution, or even finer resolution, with an SNR that matches or surpasses the one that we achieve at 3 Tesla with the
Take something, the adapter from you continue.
Yes,
I'm sorry about that.
Yes, with the 3 Tesla commercial coil. So the idea, at least for the receiver, is to model the ideal current patterns that return the optimal SNR, as we did in that example before. And we will do that for a few body models at at the 2 mm resolution that we now saw is accurate with piecewise linear basis functions. And then starting from that design, we can try to optimize the receive array to achieve the desired SNR that we want. And now the SNR is not the only important thing at these frequencies, of course. So the good thing with Marie is that you have freedom on what you can put in your cost function in this type of problems. So you can have a combination of SAR, relative homogeneity maybe, and of course the SNR. So the overall goal of this project is to be able to express the coil construction, maybe the coil design actually as an optimization problem, and you set up the parameters you want in the end, and you try to come up. You let Marie decide what your design should be. And then, of course, validation will follow with fandoms, volunteers, and image quality assessment with radiologists. So on to the next inverse problem. So this is the different type of inverse problem. So before we saw if we have an ultimate metric from simulation, what we can do here is if we have some measurements from the scanner, can we predict what sort of object gave this type of measurements? And I'm talking about the electrical properties of the object here that we know from the literature that they are particularly useful to estimate the SAR, specifically the conductivity mostly for SAR. They have the potential to improve RF and thermal-based treatments such as ablation. And in particular, I'm mostly interested for the last part that it will be a new imaging modality if it eventually happens. So it will allow us to have new biomarkers for pathology characterization, such as cancer. And I think there are some studies for cerebral ischemia as well. So how to solve this problem? There are two approaches. First, I'll solve the physics-based one, and then we'll move to the neural network. So what we can measure from the scanner is the BioMap map, not the full complex one, partial information about it. And in Marie, we can compute the BioMap with this type of equation. So M is just the magnetic permeability, F is a projection operator that takes you from the full magnetic field to the BioMap map. 8 sync is the incident magnetic field, the one that comes from the coil to the body. And this operator is just what Marie is using to compute the scattered magnetic field, the one in the body, basically. So if you write this equation and you have also the experimental measurements, you can express the problem as a box constraint optimization that iteratively gives you updated electrical properties, allows you to recompute the polarization currents in the body, and updates the BioMap map. And then compare this BioMap map with the measured one. And when your problem converges, then these electrical properties are the ones that are the true ones. And the good thing with Marie, and this comes to what I said earlier, is that Marie is good for single frequency problems because it allows customization of its algorithm, is that the gradients here can be computed analytically. So we don't need to do finite differences because that would be terribly slow. But if we solve the adjoint solution of the volume integral equation, we can compute easily not that easily, but we can compute the gradient of the cost function. The problem here is that this approach from GMT that was initially developed from Jose in MIT is that it's not really practical for experiments because we cannot really compute this incident field from the coil in the scanner. And we need to use some assumptions to get it. So what we are proposing now, again, together with Jose, is to do the volume surface integral equation-based CMT, where now your incident field from the coil comes directly from the coil currents. And this coil currents changes if the load inside the coil changes. So in every GMT iteration, we update the electrical properties, the load changes, so the coil current changes. And we can account for that in the GMT cost function. There's no problem. It's just instead of the volume integral equation, we have to solve the volume surface one. So this is how the BioMap equation changes. And now the considerations of how to actually do this in an experiment. So we came up with this triangular RF coil in a stadium substrate. So the reason for that was that our system has only 8 transmit channels. So we decided to utilize all of them. So that's an 8-channel transceiver, and we work at 7 Tesla MRI. the main reason is that we can benefit a little bit from the inhomogeneities of the field, that we can get distinct Bion+ maps that are favorable for the cost function. But the problem is still doable also in 3 Tesla and other frequencies. But for this particular problem, the higher the better, because you have these different Bion+ encodings inside the brain. So we're still in simulation here, and on the left, I have the ground truth electrical properties for the Billy head model. On the right, I have the reconstruction with the VSA GMT, and this is, we synthesize the MRI measurements and we corrupt them with some noise. And in the next columns, I have VA GMT reconstructions that use different type of instant field as an excitation. At first, we use the true electrical properties to compute the instant field. And we can see that the VAE GMT reconstruction is actually as good as the VSA one. And the smaller difference in the error, that's fine. It could be like different convergence in the optimizer. We don't really care for that. But the other 2 cases, we use approximations of the instant field, which is something that you could do practically in an experiment. And at first, we use the mean electrical properties to compute the instant field. And at second, some arbitrary electrical properties far from the mean electrical properties. And we see that those 2 reconstructions are quite bad. With the mean ones, you can kind of see the brain, but with the arbitrary ones, the reconstruction is completely wrong. And we actually had a quick discussion yesterday with Bastian about this. The reason is that the forward problem is well posed, but the inverse problem is actually very ill posed. So a small perturbation in the Bion+ maps actually can lead you to these terrible reconstructions. So this is a fundamental limitation of GMT, that essentially you would need, if you were to do a brain experiment, in reality, you would need your experimental coil and your simulated coil to truly match. So we tried to do that, and we also included a regularizer in the cost function. We built the coil, we designed these 2 phantoms. We see that the simulated and the measured maps match quite well, and we performed the reconstruction. And for the homogeneous phantom, we got pretty good values. I think the difference is less than 10% from the probe, which is the uncertainty of the probe. So that's quite good here. And for the homogeneous phantom, kind of the same, with exception of some artifacts towards the boundaries because of some B0 inhomogeneity issues that we had. But the problem was here that to do these reconstructions, in order to even just that one, when we started, we spent more than 3 months to figure out all the details and what the regularizer should look like. So you can see from here that the problem is getting quite difficult and basically kind of impractical for in vivo experiments unless we come up with a different strategy. So just to conclude the part with GMT, that okay, now we're more practical for experiments because we don't need to estimate the instant fields. But the problem is first that GMT needs a lot of time to converge. That can be up to 8 days for a 2mm resolution. It requires 8 different scans, difficult to keep someone for that long with the scanner, and is valid when your experimental and simulated measurements match. So that's quite difficult to do if you don't have your exact same coil in simulation. In reality, and of course, it requires this custom tailored coil. It doesn't have to be the one that I showed, but it can be, it has to be something that gives you these distinct measurements. So we decided, okay, we saw that the electrical property community started to move towards learning-based methods back in 2019, actually. So we said, okay, maybe we should also move at learning-based methods and see if we can actually do something better and eventually try the in vivo experiment. So what we noticed from the literature early on was that the networks that they do in other studies in the literature are very small and are trained on 2-dimensional data sets. At that time, data augmentation was a thing that didn't really exist unless you were specifically working on it. So because we don't really have a lot of realistic human body models, these works had to rely on small data sets and had to split their brains to 2D. But the problem here is that, of course, the network is difficult to generalize because you don't have a lot of data, and you violate the 3D nature of Maxwell's equations while you do it. And you start to diverge from the Maxwell equation inverse problem, and you go to a computer vision-based problem. Second, that also is along these lines, that these networks use MR images to provide an anatomical prior to the network. But this, because now you're in computer vision regime, if you don't constrain that input, the network will learn direct correlations between properties and relaxation times instead of learning the electrodynamic interactions and beyond plus maps. Then there were a few abstracts in SMRM last year that they actually showed that if you train with the T1 based image, you get different properties. If you train with a T2 based image, you get different properties again. So in order to circumvent that, at first we developed a 3D based network, and we use vision transformers instead of convolution neural networks because they allow to learn global information between input and output. And second, we trained on large data sets of tens of thousands of electrical property plus pairs. And we can do that because we have Marian, it's very fast, so we can generate as many data as we want. And to avoid using the images, we use the edge masks to identify the tissue boundaries, which are binary, so you don't really provide contrast information to the network. So our data set, the main problem is that now you start with nothing. You don't have data, you don't have a network, so you have to build everything from scratch. But you have the simulator. So we started with a simple approach, a brain package called a 3 Tesla MRI. And we simulated these geometrical objects, and we added inhomogeneous regions that resemble brain properties. And we did all the simulations at 5mm resolution with piecewise linear basis functions. I think the time for these 10,000 approach, 10,000 simulations were 4 days overall. So that's quite good. And you can use the conductivity or the permittivity to get the canny edges here. But when you do an actual experiment, you can use any MRI image to get the edges. So we created this data set of the synthetic phantoms, and then we moved to heads. So the heads, as I said earlier, there are not a lot of them. We had 6 realistic heads, and we had to do data augmentations. Data augmentations work well here because you don't really care to preserve the exact structure of the brain because you want your network to learn the inverse solution of Maxwell's equations. So as long as you give a distribution that kind of resembles the brain, you should be fine. So at first we did scaling, which means that we stretched the head towards the X, Y, and Z direction randomly for a few voxels. And that gave us around 200 variations per model. Now we excluded these Duke variations, and for the rest of the variations of the other 5 models, we did random changes inside the tissue structures, which means that we might take like one area like the gray matter and move it a few voxels and fill the missing voxels with a homogeneous electrical property. And this gave us much more cases. So we have now the Duke, that's an out of distribution model that we keep it for validation and testing. We split its augmentations for these 2 datasets, and the rest of the heads can be used for training. Now, onwards to the model that we used. Also, this is something that we didn't really have, and we didn't want to just go for a unit, so we put some thought into it. And of course, we know our inputs are beyond plus, the transit phase, which is the average between the beyond plus phase and the beyond minus phase, and you can measure this from the scanner, and the edge mask that you can get from any MRI image. The output are the 2 properties, and we decided to go for transformers instead of convolutional networks. So in each of these cascade, we put a 3-dimensional transformer unit. And the reason that we have these 3 sequential connection of units is because that we have 5mm resolution. So you cannot go any more than 2 layers, 2 levels deep in the unit. So we had to make the network deeper in a different type of sense. So we follow this cascaded connection. And for normalization, instead of going for instance normalization, we found in the literature that this feature-wise linear modulation that basically does this affine transformation in your feature vectors leads to better out of distribution performance. So we decided to go for that. And your film generator can be just a few convolution layers. It doesn't really matter. So now we have the 2 data sets, and we notice that it's better if you train the model on the synthetic phantoms that have more electrical properties. So and they're simpler. So your network can try to learn first there in this more simpler case, and then we fine tune it on the realistic heads. So with this approach, we avoid overfitting. Now, this is how our reconstructions look like. And you can immediately see that these are quite well, especially like if you have these distinct areas inside your phantom, and the edge mask allows you to reconstruct even single voxels in the case. There are some limitations, especially in the middle of the phantoms with this type of interpolation artifacts. And this is a limitation of the transpose convolutions in the units that can be fixed with interpolation strategies. For the heads, which are of most interest, we get good reconstructions with the exceptions of some artifacts towards the edges where the SNR is low and blurriness between the gray and white matter, which is also expected because this information, if you have noises, cannot really be encoded well in the Biomedical map. So, and I should note that these are out of distribution models. Like this is the test data set. This is a variations of Duke. The model has never seen those. And then we move to more challenging cases, such as synthetic lesions. Only 2% of our training data were synthetic lesions, so the model was not really trained on them. But we see that in the reconstruction, you can still kind of detect it. Basically, you detect in all of the cases, but your accuracy is not really trustworthy. So I would trust its detection capabilities, but not the actual prediction. And in order to improve performance, you need to train the model with more cases with synthetic pathologies, and of course, including homogeneous cases to be more realistic. Now on to the practical validation, back to the phantom that we use for GMT. We collect the Biomedical map, the GRE image to get the edge masks, and we also did the spin echo, I think, to get the transient phase. We see that the permittivity looks quite good and error pretty low, while the conductivity has a little bit higher error, close to 20%, which agrees with the errors that we see in the literature, with the exception that in our reconstruction is much more homogeneous comparing to the literature results. Now towards the more impressive results. To get the edge masks, we did the empiric image, and you can immediately see that if we scale down to 5 millimeter, the edge mask does not look very well, but it's the best we could do with this resolution. And the Biomedical you can get with the RF map. It's quite fast. It's built in for Siemens scanners. And I think it also includes the spin echo when you do it. So you also have together the transient phase with the same scan. And this is how the permittivity and conductivity looks. The average value for the entire brain agrees with the literature once, but because of partial voluming, we could not really compare individual tissues. And this is for comparison, the reconstruction with the PD-based method. And here basically you cannot really see the brain. You have values that go below 0 that are essentially completely wrong. So this is a promising step, and the newest result that we caught is this case with uncharacterized white matter lesion, and it seems quite big at 1 millimeter, but when you go to 5 millimeter, it's only 2 voxels. But the network was still able to find it. Again, I wouldn't trust the values that I saw here, but I would trust its detection because from the surrounding tissue, the value there is different. So that's also quite promising. But in order to take this to a step further, you need to simulate a larger data set. I would go for 100,000 cases this time, and I would also go for 2 millimeter voxel resolution. And this seems that it will take some time, but we're exploring some options with cloud computing to generate this data set. I will also look for better augmentation strategies that better preserve the brain structure, and would include synthetic pathologies with realistic values from the literature. There are a few studies that they do this now for classic MR image reconstruction, so we can utilize similar approaches here. And then, of course, you need to improve the network, particularly the loss function, to be able to focus on the lesions themselves instead of the whole brain. So if you're having homogeneity in some areas, this cannot be captured with the edge masks. You you have to still account for it. Now, since we talked about supervised learning, and you can forget everything we talked from before, we'll go to the last slides that focus on accelerated image reconstruction. So this is the method that NYU and Florian Noll introduced a few years ago. This is called the variational network. So we start from iterative regularized methods, basically compressed sensing, but we know they can give us good reconstructions for parallel acquisitions. And the way the problem is formulated is as this inverse problem that you update your K-space in every iteration of the gradient descent, and you have your regularizer Q here, so this is this gradient. And there's a bunch of different mathematical stuff here, but they're all related to the parallel imaging physics, so it's not really something that you haven't seen before. So what the variational network does and why it was a little bit ahead of its time then was that it said, okay, this regularizer is usually total variation, Tikhonov, or whatever. There was a big literature, a lot of studies, then tons of papers with tailored regularizations, but none of them became clinical. So the variational network said, okay, I will replace this gradient of the regularizer with a neural network, and I will keep my physics intact, and I will learn only how to denoise based on data. And the data will tell me the best regularizer. And this was really great and worked really well, and it became clinical. That's why most of the vendors now have their clinical AI-based models. So my work on this project came after the introduction of the variational network, and we wanted to see if we can modify a little bit the architecture of the variational network so you can get even better reconstructions without escalating the memory or prolonging the inference time. So at first, we did 3 modifications. At first, we did the feature varnet that adapts architecture to perform training in a feature space. I'll explain that in the next slide. And because of the feature space now, we are able to use attention mechanisms, and that we can follow a tailored strategy to better denoise the image. And then you have now, since you have a new network and the old network that works in image space, you can do a cross-domain learning approach. So the feature varnet, instead of following the equation of the end-to-end variational network, changes the equation to this. So basically what we do now, instead of having the image in each of these cascade of the network, its gradient descent iteration, we keep this representation in a feature space that we can get it from encoding it with just a convolution layer. And then we can do the update directly in the feature space. And our data consistency still remains in K-space, which is this part of the equation. So the good thing here is that instead of starting its unit with 2 channels that correspond to the complex image, we can start them directly with any number of channels you want, so 32 in this case, or 64 maybe. So it means that you never downsample the number of channels, and as you propagate through the cascades, so this allows you to retain this additional information that might be lost in the end-to-end environment. And there's this purple box here that is the attention module. So because we're in feature space, we can benefit from attention. So this is like a small transformer, but the idea we had here is that we know how the aliasing artifacts look like in Cartesian undersampling. So for this 12 by 12 example, the Cartesian artifacts will be copies basically in intervals of 3 pixels. So the same colors correspond to the same type of artifacts. And I have the freedom to reshape this in any type of matrix I want. So I can put all the aliasing artifacts together, and then I can apply my matrix multiplication in the attention. So now the weights in the attention have the freedom to learn where the same artifacts appear in the image. And I follow the reverse process when I output from the attention module, so I can reshape back to my original dimensions. This basically helps the attention module to capture better these aliasing artifacts and denoise a little bit better. So, and then, yeah, finally, we have the feature image varnet. Just connect the feature and the image varnet together to do a cross-domain learning. Yeah, and And to the results, we trained the model on the brain and knee fast MRI datasets. We did 4- and 5-fold undersampling. We kept the size of each model the same, and we saw that the more of the architectural modifications you do, the slightly better the performance is. So you switch to a feature space, you get a little bit of boost in the SSIM, tiny, but still important in machine learning. If you add attention a little bit more, and if you do the joint training with the feature image, still a little bit more. And then we went to compare with the fast MRI leaderboard, which includes, that was a challenge that happened in 2022, that includes 2020, that includes a lot of open source models and the model from a company, there's Net. And there we were able to achieve second place in the 4 times acceleration, and almost second place again, third place, but almost second place in the 8 times acceleration. They were only outperformed by the Net model, which at that time we didn't really know, but later we asked, and they told us that they performed further data processing in the fast MRI dataset, and that's why they were able to get this additional strong performance improvement here. But in terms of architectural modification, we're equally as good as them.
Liz,
Yes.
Sanity check on these metrics, like, are the differences in the SSIM and PSNR meaningful here? They almost look like points. They're so small.
Yes.
It
So
seems like something's almost equivalent.
yes. So we qualitatively what that means basically. Yes. So yeah, qualitatively. So at first, I mean, this is consistent, right? If you retrain the network, you will still get these results. So it's not that you have the small standard deviation there. So it's always like that. And qualitatively, this might mean that some artifacts that you might have, for example, you miss this blood vessel in the end-to-end VARNet, you can still get it in the feature image VARNet. Or here, for example, this doesn't exist in the ground truth, but you still have it in the end-to-end VARNet. And you're a little bit sharper. So we did a clinical study for this to see if these changes make sense. And the overall conclusion that we got is that the images with the new models look sharper. But clinically, there is no benefit. And that made us think a little bit to go to the next project that I'm working on, that these metrics are good for computer vision tasks, but when it comes to medical imaging, they're essentially useless if you want to push for higher acceleration factors. So you're right, the changes are not really noise, but they're indifferent from what the radiologist kind of want. So if you want to go towards higher acceleration factors, maybe at 6x, and be clinical there, you need to rethink of the metrics that you can use that essentially don't care for these blood vessels, you care for the features around the pathologies to be preserved correctly. So this is the project that I'm currently working on, but unfortunately I don't have any results here. So to conclude, yeah, I'm talking quite a lot, I'm sorry. So for electromagnetic simulations, open source software is really important. It allows us to share our methods with the community, and mostly for me, it allows us to collaborate with people and connect different methods together. So we aim to open source release also the wire surface volume approach and the co-simulator and the optimization basically. And yeah, we saw that these novel methods can enable coil optimization and performance assessment for even clinically valid resolutions. And there is a potential to tackle the unmet need of novel coils for 7 Tesla body imaging application, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done there. For electrical properties, we saw proof that the physics-based method can give us reconstructions without assumptions for some simple phantoms, but we also saw that machine learning now maybe it's its turn to lead this type of research and push for reconstructions for in vivo cases. And for image reconstructions, we can see some sub-performance improvement, but as Jason said, not really that much. So the answer is not really on the architecture that you follow anymore for these networks. It's more of how you train them and what type of loss you use for the training. So if I was a reviewer and I saw a grant on this type of approaches, first I would ask, okay, good simulations, very nice methods, but why do you care? Like what is the coil that you want to develop with these methods, and can it actually benefit this anatomy? Can it benefit ultra high field imaging or no? And I would maybe also at low field MRIs, can these methods give me some actual maps of the ultimate SNR bounds that you can have in these frequencies, so you can design new coils there. For electrical properties, again, maybe the exact map is not as useful as we thought initially, but if you can find an application where the electrical properties can give you a better biomarker than traditional MRI can, then maybe that will be an interesting road to explore. And finally, for image reconstruction, MRI, me in the beginning, and a lot of people that come from machine learning background, they think of an MRI as some sort of image generator. So they think, okay, I will make a network, and as long as my image looks similar to the ground truth image, I'm fine. And if it gets better numbers, that's also fine, because that's how the machine learning community at least used to work. But that's not true in MRI. MRI is not only an image, right? It's the exam that goes, the radiologist report that goes to the patient. So the question that we need to be asking is, can the image that my network can generate, will it give the same radiology report as the ground truth image will? And this is the comparison that we should be doing, and not in the image space. So we need to collaborate with medical doctors for sure for this type of approaches, and not only on image reconstruction, but also if you're going to super resolution, low field imaging, sodium imaging, for example. So this is I think that how we should be thinking at this type of problems from now on. And yeah, to conclude, I'd like to thank my fans from the K99, the R1s and the P41 at NYU, and a lot of collaborations from NYU, especially Ricardo, Dan, and Ryan, that serve as my mentors for the K99, Jacob and Luca that supervised my PhD, Larry, Jason, and Bastian here for the invitation and for all the support these years, and a few external collaborations in Minnesota, Camille and Gregory also, that they continuously help us for these ultimate SNR studies that we do. And you for your attention.